think these are just shows that, of all the shows I've seen now over like all the many years, these are ones that still stand out in my mind because um, they made me think about the form of a show differently. They made me think about clothes differently, and they made me think about what could be conveyed through a show differently. Okay, so this is Yohji Yamamoto's Spring Summer 1999 show. I had just started going to fashion shows. It was probably like my, I don't know, first season, second season, and I really did not know what I was doing and did not really understand this strange beast called fashion that I had, this place where I had found myself, because I hadn't come from the fashion world. I had never intended to be a fashion journalist. I had never really I'd never been in a full season. It was probably my first full season of shows. And so I was really like you know, a deer in the headlights most of the time. And what I remember about this one, obviously I knew who Yohji was. This just may have been my first Yohji show. And I was really late because I had gotten lost in Paris, or I got stuck in traffic or something. And I was in a kind of panic, I think, because I thought he was really important and this was something I needed to see, and I was worried I would miss it. So I ran in at the end, and I think I was sitting like crouched in a corner somewhere on the side. So I was in a terrible state of mind for viewing a Yohji show, which is incredibly serene and peaceful and, very paced. And I just remember it started, and it was really like entering a different world. And as the show built, I got more and more kind of lulled into this world that he had created. And it was one of the very first times, I think, that I really understood the point of a fashion show, and what a fashion show could do, and what the theater of it could do, and how important it was to see clothes in action on a model the way the designer wanted them to be seen. So not necessarily the way a magazine editor wanted them to be seen, or, through the prism of retail, but really in that kind of very pure sense. And I've never forgotten it. It was a quintessential, I realized later, quintessential Yohji show, with the hats and the very monochromatic color palette, and the very slow walk, which we still see, but also the grace, the extraordinary grace, and his ability to tap into this kind of really intricate and very academic couture history in terms of construction and silhouette and shape, but then make it feel really contemporary. And this was this extraordinary moment in the middle of it when Malgosia came out in this really simple petticoat, really, and camisole. And I remember just thinking oh, that's a pretty dress. And then she started to interact with it in a way that we don't normally interact with our hoop skirts. But so she pulls out shoes, and then she keeps going, and her coat. And again, it's a kind of almost undergarment that becomes a outer garment. Hat, because hats are very important to Yohji, which is almost like a cloud. Her gloves. And you can see an audience applauding. Actually, at that stage, even in '99, people weren't applauding very much during shows. The sort of era of the very effusive audience was coming to an end. I think at the end of the '90s, people were kind of being cooler about their reaction to things. But I think it was just such a kind of helplessly joyful moment in fashion that people just spontaneously clapped. And it really was, even for someone who was relatively jaded and suspicious of it, a kind of magic moment. I mean, you've got Andre Leontali, who at that point was probably creative director of Vogue, this extraordinary man, playing the semi-groom, which was kind of an inside joke. And again, this sort of play on menswear and women's wear, which Yohji did and has always done so well, and with so much nuance and depth. This was the heyday of the Shalom Amber, right? Modeling era. And she had this very elaborately corseted strapless dress, which she discarded and just dropped on the floor. And then there was another layer that she took off. I mean, it's like discarding eras and associations, but also connecting them. You can see like all these layers built up into a final garment, into how we think about dress. Got another ball, seemingly, ball gown, but it's also like it's a puffer. Long before people were talking about streetwear and the way streetwear influenced fashion, all that. I mean, it's he was so ahead of his time. Yohji wasn't a set guy. He didn't build these incredible backdrops to distract you. It really is. I mean, and it still is. It's it's about making you look at the clothes and focus on that. But he, it's a real sort of clarity of presentation, because the models and the clothes and the music and the pace. I think the pace is really important with Yohji. They walk deliberately, and the dress is deliberate. And it was a pure, as you say, way of showing. And it works if the clothes can rise to the occasion. It doesn't work if the clothes aren't good enough. I mean, I still always go to Yohji shows, but his, a lot of people have fallen away from his audience, and I always get slightly annoyed by it, because I think he deserves to be seen. He has given so much to fashion and has been excellent for so long, that just because the kind of buzziness of shows has changed and what people want out of them has changed does not mean that you shouldn't show him the respect and honor I think he deserves. Actually, I try not to go backstage after shows, because it becomes once you do it once, then it becomes an obligation to do it all the time. And if you don't do it, then designers get neurotic about it and paranoid. And so I just think it's like a bad precedent to set. And also, as a critic, I feel very much that, like, if I don't get the point by seeing the clothes on the runway, then that's an issue. I shouldn't have to go backstage to ask a designer what their idea was. I should understand their idea. And in a way, once clothes are out in the world, it doesn't even matter what the designer's idea was, because it's up to the consumer, or it's the eye of the beholder to decide what the point is. So really, it's in the seams. And if you can't get it in the seams, or you can't get it on the runway when you actually, have this moment where it's the pure expression of your vision as a designer, then you probably haven't thought it through clearly enough. This is the Hussein Chalayan Autumn-Winter 2000 show, and it took place at Sadler's Wells, the theater in London, which is really like his signature show place. And this was, again, relatively early on in my fashion covering career. This was really the time when London was in the midst of this flowering of theatrical shows, right? There was, McQueen was doing the most unbelievable sets and experiences in garages, and Hussein was doing, what is effectively performance art. And so having the show in the theater made a huge amount of sense, because it was very much how he was thinking about clothes. The clothing was a sort of movable sculpture, and it told a story, and there was a narrative to it. And by putting it on a set like this, it made it very clear that what you were seeing was not just like, a dress that you were supposed to put on and go to work, but although you could do that, but something that had this whole superstructure behind it, and and a kind of personality and a character of its own. And what I have always loved about Hussein's work is that he, is often thought of as this very conceptual, complicated, intellectual, sometimes irritatingly so, designer. But he's also an extraordinary tailor. He's so good at construction and cut. And I mean, just seeing how you can make a jacket fall like that, so it creates this real sort of petticoat effect that you can see as though there are layers and layers of tulle underneath, but in fact, it's simply the way that the fabric is put together is, so, again, like modern. Like these are beautiful and actually very wearable clothes, and wearable is often a word that isn't associated with Hussein. But to me, this is like his quintessential collection, because it does show all these different sides to him. His kind of his formal understanding of fashion, and also his the incredible imaginative leaps he made with it. This was really a moment when retailers and students and editors were all kind of clamoring to get in to see what was going to come next from Hussein and from McQueen and from Stella. That this was and from Antonio Berardi. I mean, London was just making new stuff, and people wanted to see it. And shows were really late, and no one cared, because you knew that once they happened, you would see something that was so satisfying, in terms of moving your idea of what women should wear forward, in terms of making you think about new things, and and just in terms of sort of visual satisfaction, that you'd come out of there happy, even though by the time it started you were so irritated because you'd been sitting there for so long and it was cold, or you were stuck outside, or whatever. I mean, and there were no fire regulations in half the venues, and people were just like jammed in there, and it didn't matter, because there was just stuff that was bubbling up creatively, and you could really feel that. I certainly had no idea what was going to happen with the table and chairs. I think I was still so new to all of this that it hadn't occurred to me to be suspicious of everything that was on stage. That, if it was there, maybe it was there for a reason and something fun was going to happen with it. I think I probably just thought, oh, nice set. But I also honestly try to come to each show with as few expectations of what I'm going to see as possible, just to, let a designer surprise me and absorb how they are using their work to comment on whatever's going on around us at the time. And of course, the problem is, after Hussein did this, he couldn't do another show with anything present other than a pure white wall, without everybody in the audience being like, what's going to happen with this? What's going to happen with this? So in a way, he raised the bar for himself to a really difficult level. Yeah, I often think going to Fashion Week is like going to Fashion Month, is like going to a lot of many, many modern art galleries. And a lot of what you see is derivative or boring or bad or dumb. And then every once in a while you see something and it is so great that you forget everything else. And you're like, I love this so much. And it makes you want to keep going. But again, it's funny because Hussein does have this reputation as a really difficult designer and a very intellectual designer. And these are really just beautiful clothes. You could wear pretty much anything that's come out on stage, that we've seen now, and feel absolutely right on. Right, so then out come these women in very simple shifts, And we're all sort of sitting there thinking like, oh, okay, fine. And then they start to undress the chair. What are they doing? It's something else entirely. And I do feel like this was the collection, this was the moment that presaged all the work that Hussein did afterwards, really looking at, again, transformation and automation and kind of transmogrification of materials and the way that clothes almost act like engineered mechanisms on the body. I mean, it really is performance art more than a fashion show by a traditional definition. But then life is performance art to a certain extent. And there you have table as skirt. It's interesting talking about it in terms of this idea that designers, come at their shows with certain inspirations, and then people who see it take away different ideas. I think for Hussein, as you mentioned, a lot of this was to do with kind of forced immigration, right? And how you can you take the clothes on your back, you take the furniture on your back with you when you leave. He is a Cypriot. He's a Turkish Cypriot. And, I think he's always been very connected to that kind of history and his own sense of maybe himself as somewhat of an outsider in the UK. Although I think most people were so dazzled by the mechanics of the actual performance that they didn't connect it necessarily to forced immigration. It also shows the way you can take subjects that are really complicated and fraught and painful and make them into something that is, dazzling. Okay, so here we go, Dries, Spring Summer 2005. This is actually, it was a collection in honor or in recognition of his 50th show. And it was held in these old warehouses way on the outskirts of Paris. And I remember at that point I was sharing a car with Susie Menkes. I think we were driving around together. And we were both like, where are we going? It was not really, at that point, it wasn't that usual to have a show really far away or late at night or to have food involved. And so we got there and we walked in and there was this huge long table. And there were all these crystal chandeliers, different kinds of crystal chandeliers, hanging low kind of over the middle. And we, again, I had no idea what was about to happen. We took our seats. And then these two columns, these parades of waiters came out. And every waiter had 2 plates. And they all went, boom. And they put the plates down at exactly the same time. Then the chandeliers went up. They were all on a truss. And I have no idea how many chandeliers there were. There were probably 50, 75, something like that. But this is still, to this day, almost 20 years later, not quite 20 years later, this is still my ultimate dinner party, ultimate large gala event. I think this was the classiest example I've ever seen. So the chandeliers go up, and then the fashion show begins down the middle of the table. It was fast. This is a lot of shows at that point were a sort of stately pace. This was not a stately pace. This was really he kept it moving. And it was an interesting perspective because you were kind of down, looking up at the girls. This to me is the quintessential Dries show because it was so generous with his audience. And he is, I think, as a designer, just an incredibly generous person. He's generous with his references. He's generous in the way he shapes things around your body. And he's generous with the people who come, who buy his clothes and who see his clothes. There's just something really personal about it and thoughtful of others. And I love that it was all sort of white in the beginning as like a, I don't know, breath of fresh air or new start after 50 collections, which is a lot of collections. At that stage, Dries had really, had established what he still has, which is a very, very specific sort of fan base. He has his own aesthetic. He had it from the beginning when he came to Paris as part of the Antwerp Six, and he stuck with it. So he really had kind of carved out a niche for himself, but it was a niche. It was not, he wasn't sort of central to Paris in the way that like Dior was, or Chanel was, or even at that stage, Galliano was. I think he was a much more, he was a gentler designer, and his shows were gentler, and his fan base was slightly gentler. But because it was also singular and very specific, it had a really devoted following, and it was clear that he mattered. Because anyone who has that much of a specific point of view, I think, is important as a designer. That's a really hard thing to do. And he has always done it. Dries knew that he was asking people to come far and to be there late. And therefore, he was going to give you something in return to sort of thank you for your time. It was, again, it's very characteristic of him as a designer. And it was really just nice. He told me afterwards that all the waiters were students that they had hired, and he was terrified that none of that kind of waiter choreography would work, and that it was a miracle that it had come off, and they were able to get all the food out at the same time and take it all away at the same time, and you didn't see any of that sitting there. Again, it's also very characteristic of Dries, because he thinks about every detail, so that even if his work can look very relaxed and very casual in some ways, it is entirely considered. And it's considered not just in how it would fall on the body, but how it would feel on the body, and how you can walk in it, and how you can move in it, and how you can sit in it. And, it's never constricting or painful. A lot of fashion can be quite painful, and his work is never like that. And his shows aren't like that. Which again, I think, speaks to the grandeur, not the grandeur, the kind of expanse of his point of view, the fact that he really does, it's all of a whole. Afterwards, everyone who left got a book. I think he'd made a book of his 50 collections, and tucked into the book was a Polaroid of the chandelier in front of your seat at the table. And that, to me was just the ultimate kind of final touch, because it was so personal and so individual, not fancy, not elaborate or gaudy, but just so personal and lovely. The idea that here, that kind of detail was given to you just made you feel special, even though you weren't, because everyone got the same thing. And that's what clothes should do again. Fashion should make you feel special. So it was just another kind of part of that mosaic. There is something to be said for the critical mass that occurs around a fashion week, and having everything happening at the same time. In a way, it gives you a momentum and a narrative that I think is a way to talk about fashion in a coherent way that sometimes you don't get when they're just random shows happening sort of one week, and then maybe 2 weeks later, and then another time. Maybe that's on us, that we have to figure out a new way to talk about it, or maybe it's just the way it is. It was hard for Dries, though, because then when he got to his 100th show, it was like, how do you top this one? He flew models in. He took his whole budget and used it to fly models in from all over the world who had been in different shows of his. And he spent it on them.